January 5th, 1942. The streets of Tokyo are in chaos, not from bombs, but from hysterical joy. Thousands of civilians are flooding the Ginza district, screaming "Banzai" under a sea of paper lanterns. The Empire has crushed Pearl Harbor. The British battleships are sinking. To the drunk crowds chanting in the capital, the war is already won. But thousands of miles away, anchored in the cold, gray silence of Hiroshima Bay,
sits the massive battleship Yamato, and inside its steel hull, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto is not celebrating. He is terrified. Welcome to WW2 History Real. While the politicians in Tokyo are drunk on victory, dreaming of an invincible empire, Yamamoto is staring at a tactical map, and he sees a death sentence. He knows something the crowds do not. He is virtually a prisoner on his own flagship. Why?
Because back in the capital, the army hardliners want him dead. They call him a coward for opposing an endless war. He knows that if he steps foot in Tokyo, the secret police, or a fanatic with a sword, could assassinate him before the sun sets. His fear isn't new. Months earlier, in a smoke-filled room at the Imperial Navy Club, he had a secret meeting with his close friend, the nationalist leader Ryoichi Sasakawa. Yamamoto leaned in, his voice slow, and he used a terrifying metaphor. He told Sasakawa that Japan was not a dragon, but an octopus. He said the empire was stretching its tentacles across the vast Pacific Ocean, stretching them further and further until they were spread paper thin. He knew that the moment those tentacles were cut, the body would die.
He looked his friend in the eye and delivered a prophecy that was about to come true. "I can run wild for 6 months," he said, "maybe 12. But after that, I have no expectation of success." The clock was already ticking. Yamamoto was not a mystic guessing at the future. He was a realist who had looked the enemy in the eye. He had walked the halls of power in Washington, D.C.
As a naval attaché, he had sat across from the British lords at the London naval conferences. He understood the industrial capability of the West better than any general in Tokyo. He told his contacts in the government, "Wait for Singapore." He believed that the moment the great British fortress of Singapore fell, the British Empire would be shaken to its core. That would be the window. That would be the only moment to force a peace treaty. To the rest of the world, the Axis looked unstoppable. By January 5th, the American battleship fleet was a smoking graveyard in Hawaii. The pride of the Royal Navy, the Prince of Wales, and the Repulse were rusting at the bottom of the sea off the Malay coast. Hong Kong had surrendered. The Japanese war machine was carving up the Dutch East Indies, swallowing Rabaul and Ambon. Lord Yamamoto was haunted by a failure. The failure that kept him awake at night while his crew celebrated. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical masterpiece, but a strategic disaster. Why? Because the American aircraft carriers were not there. The Enterprise, the Lexington, the Saratoga. They were not burning in the oil-slicked waters of Pearl Harbor. They were out there, ghosts in the vast Pacific, unharmed, deadly. Yamamoto knew that as long as those flat tops were floating, Japan was living on borrowed time.
He didn't just need another victory. He needed a spectacular achievement. He needed to lure those ghosts into a trap and destroy them before the American industrial machine could replace them. On February 15, 1942, the impossible happened. Singapore fell. The Gibraltar of the East crumbled, and 80,000 British troops surrendered. Yamamoto saw his opening. It was time to choose the next move. But inside the war rooms of Tokyo, a bitter rivalry paralyzed the strategy.
The Imperial Army and the Imperial Navy were not just separate branches. They were rivals, often hating each other more than the enemy. The army vetoed an attack on the Soviet Union. They were already bogged down in the infinite quagmire of China. They refused to send more men into the Russian meat grinder. So Yamamoto proposed a plan that, had it succeeded, could have changed the course of history. He wanted to strike west, into the Indian Ocean. His vision was terrifying in its ambition. He wanted to invade Ceylon, destroy the British Eastern Fleet, and push all the way to the Middle East. His goal? To link up with Erwin Rommel and the German forces driving toward the Caucasus oil fields. If the Japanese Navy met the German panzers in Persia, the Axis would control the world's oil. But the army said no. They refused to supply the troops for such a massive expedition.
That left the Naval General Staff with Option B, Operation Australia. The plan was ruthless. They wouldn't invade the vast continent of Australia directly. That would take too many men. Instead, they would strangle it. They planned to seize New Guinea, Fiji, and Samoa, cutting the lifeline between the United States and Australia. In Tokyo, bureaucrats were already drafting occupation laws for the Australian people. But Yamamoto hated this plan. Why? Because it was too slow.
A siege takes months, even years, and Yamamoto knew he didn't have years. He knew that Pearl Harbor hadn't broken the American spirit. It had ignited a firestorm of vengeance. He didn't need a slow suffocation. He needed a knockout punch. Yamamoto was desperate. He didn't want a long war of attrition. He wanted a generous olive branch, a peace treaty dictated from a position of strength.
So, in January 1942, he ordered his staff to draft two plans that would change the war. The first was the MI plan. The target, Midway Island, a tiny speck of sand in the middle of the ocean. But the goal wasn't the island. The goal was to use the island as bait. Yamamoto knew that if he threatened Midway, the American carriers, those elusive ghosts, would have to come out and fight, and there he would slaughter them.
The second was the AL plan, the invasion of American soil. He planned to strike the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Yamamoto's vision was grand. If he took Midway and the Aleutians, Hawaii would be isolated. The American West Coast would be in panic. Washington would be forced to negotiate. But back in Tokyo, the Naval General Staff argued. They hated the plan. They thought it was too risky.
The admirals screamed at each other across the conference tables for weeks. Then, on April 18, 1942, the argument ended abruptly. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle and 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers did the impossible. They launched from a carrier, flew under the radar, and dropped bombs on the sacred soil of Tokyo. The physical damage was minor, but the psychological shock was catastrophic. The Emperor, a living god, had been threatened.
The Japanese High Command realized that the American giant wasn't just awake, it was at their front door. Yamamoto got his wish. The Midway operation was approved instantly. But instead of the decisive victory he dreamed of, June 1942 turned into a funeral pyre. In one day, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers: the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The defeat was so absolute, so shameful, that the Navy decided to lie. They hid the truth from the Emperor.
They hid the truth from the army. The Japanese people were told it was a great victory, while the charred bodies of their best pilots were sinking into the abyss. While the Japanese public was being fed lies about a glorious victory at Midway, the truth was burying them. 4 essential aircraft carriers were at the bottom of the sea. But the war didn't stop for grief. The Japanese war machine simply shifted gears. It turned its hungry eyes south, towards Australia. The pivot point was Rabaul. Captured back in January, the Japanese had transformed this sleepy port into the Gibraltar of the Pacific, a fortress bristling with airfields and naval pens. From this stronghold, they launched a reign of terror. In Australia, panic was setting in, and for good reason. In February, Japanese bombers had obliterated the city of Darwin, dropping more bombs than they had on Pearl Harbor.
The message was clear. You are next. When General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Australia in March, he saw the map and realized the end game. The Japanese were moving to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea. If Port Moresby fell, Japanese bombers would be within easy range of Australian cities. The invasion of the continent would be inevitable. The Japanese army was already on the move, seizing Lae and Salamaua in March, carving a bloody path through the jungle.
But their big prize, Port Moresby, required an invasion from the sea. That invasion fleet set sail in May, only to run into a wall of American steel. The Battle of the Coral Sea. It was the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never saw each other. It was fought entirely by aircraft. Tactically, it was a mess. But strategically, it saved Australia. The Japanese invasion force turned back. But they didn't leave empty-handed.
They seized a tiny island north of Guadalcanal called Tulagi. They immediately began building a seaplane base. In Washington, the mood was grim. MacArthur was screaming for reinforcements. He demanded 2 aircraft carriers and 1,000 planes to stop the Japanese advance. But Admiral Ernest King, the cold-blooded chief of naval operations, had to tell him the brutal reality. No. The reason was simple math. On the eve of Midway, the Japanese had 10 carriers.
The United States. Until the end of June,
They had exactly 2 fully operational flat tops in the entire Pacific Ocean. They were fighting a global war on a shoestring budget. And the Japanese were digging in. The Japanese war machine was like a train with no brakes. Even after the disaster at Midway, the orders from Tokyo didn't change. Advance. In New Guinea, Major General Tomataro Hori landed his elite South Seas force.
They seized Leh and Salamaua, hacking airfields out of the jungle. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hikutake was ordered to push even further. New Caledonia, Fiji, Samoa. The Imperial General Staff was still dreaming of cutting off Australia, assuming Yamamoto's fleet would protect them. They didn't know, or refused to believe, that Yamamoto's fleet was already at the bottom of the ocean. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, a different kind of war was brewing. A war between egos.
General Douglas MacArthur, the American Caesar, saw the Japanese move. He demanded an immediate counterattack. His plan was bold, a direct assault on the Japanese fortress of Rabaul. He promised to drive the enemy back to their stronghold at Truk Lagoon. All he needed were 3 aircraft carriers and a Marine division. But in Washington, Admiral Ernest King slammed his fist on the table. King hated the Army, and he despised MacArthur.
He refused to hand over his precious aircraft carriers to an Army general who he believed would get them sunk by land-based bombers. So King devised his own plan, a Navy-led offensive starting from the New Hebrides. The compromises made in Washington were messy. The Joint Chiefs drew lines on a map. Admiral King got Phase 1, the seizure of the Santa Cruz Islands and Tulagi.
And almost as an afterthought, they circled a jungle island that had no strategic name, just a spot on the chart where the Japanese were building an airfield. Guadalcanal. Admiral Ernest King was a man who didn't take no for an answer. He got his way. He convinced the Joint Chiefs that the Navy could protect the lifeline to Australia with fewer men than the Army. He had already begun fortifying a chain of islands across the South Pacific, New Caledonia, Samoa, and Efate in the New Hebrides. King was ruthless with his subordinates. Admiral Wilson Brown, who had hesitated during the Wake Island crisis, was removed from combat command. King shipped him off to San Diego to run training drills. In King's Navy, if you didn't fight, you were gone. To lead the upcoming offensive, King turned to his own war plans officer, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. Turner was brilliant, abrasive, and aggressive. He drew up a 4-stage plan to march across the Pacific, island by bloody island, all the way to the Philippines. But King needed a commander for the South Pacific Theater. He made a controversial choice. He summoned Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley. Gormley had been serving as a diplomat in London. He was intelligent, but he had been sitting in offices far away from the Pacific. He wasn't a jungle fighter. He wasn't aggressive like Halsey or King. King ordered Gormley to Pearl Harbor and told him to get ready. Turner was detached from Washington to command the amphibious ships. The pieces were moving on the chessboard.
But there was a problem. The Americans were planning an invasion, but they didn't even know where the Japanese were.
The clock started ticking on May 22nd. An Allied plane spotted a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft buzzing over a large, flat plain on the north coast of Guadalcanal. It was ominous. By June 25th, the warning signs turned into a crisis. Army intelligence reported that the tall kunai grass at Lunga Point had been burned off. Tents were going up. A wharf was being built. The Japanese weren't just occupying the island. They were building an airfield.
If they finished it, their long-range bombers could sever the lifeline between America and Australia. The war in the Pacific would be lost. Then came the confirmation. Martin Clements, an Australian coast watcher hiding in the jungle hills overlooking the beach, sent a radio message. He reported that Japanese construction troops, the 11th and 13th Pioneer Units, were landing. Thousands of miles away at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz's codebreakers intercepted the same information.
They cracked a Japanese naval message confirming the arrival of these units on July 4th. Fleet intelligence put 2 and 2 together. The enemy was digging in. Admiral Kelly Turner was at Pearl Harbor when the report landed on Nimitz's desk. He looked at the map and realized his destination. It wasn't going to be a simple occupation. It was going to be a race. He had to get to the Solomons, land his Marines, and take that airfield before the Japanese planes could land. Turner flew immediately to Wellington, New Zealand. He had less than a month to prepare an invasion fleet from scratch. Admiral Kelly Turner had a job that was technically impossible. He had 1 month to train a raw amphibious force to invade a hostile jungle island. Meanwhile, the overall commander, Vice Admiral Gormley, flew to Melbourne to meet General MacArthur.
The mood in the room was black. Both men agreed this operation was madness. They didn't have enough ships. They didn't have enough planes. They didn't know the terrain. On July 18th, just 3 weeks before D-Day, they sent a desperate message to Washington. They begged Admiral King to postpone the invasion. King's answer was cold and immediate. No. The operation would proceed, even if they weren't ready, and they definitely weren't ready. The intelligence was a disaster.
The planners knew so little about Guadalcanal that early maps placed the Japanese airfield on the wrong side of the island. They were about to send 19,000 Marines onto a beach they had never seen, against an enemy strength they could only guess at. Unbeknownst to them, they had almost run out of time. Admiral Yamamoto had already issued orders. On August 14th, Japanese bombers would start flying from that airfield. The trap was about to snap shut.
The invasion force was sailing into a nightmare. Admiral Gormley begged for more time and resources, but Washington had nothing to give. The logistics were a disaster. In Oakland, California, dock workers had loaded the supply ships in a panic. They threw equipment in hodgepodge, food mixed with ammo, critical radios buried under tons of useless gear. When the ships arrived at Noumea to reorganize, there were no docks.
The Marines had to unload and reload their own ships in the rain, while the clock ticked down. 19,000 Marines were about to hit the beach.
but their commanders were at war with each other. On July 28th, the tactical commanders met face-to-face for the first time aboard the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga. It was an ugly meeting. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, the man in charge of the carriers, was nervous.
He had already lost the Lexington and the Yorktown in previous battles. He was gun-shy. He looked at Admiral Turner and General Alexander Vandegrift, the Marine commander, and dropped a bombshell. "I will keep my carriers in the area for 48 hours, Fletcher said. "After 2 days, I am withdrawing." Vandegrift was stunned. It takes days to unload an invasion force. If Fletcher left after 2 days, the Marines would be stranded on a hostile island without air cover, exposed to the entire Japanese Navy. But Fletcher didn't care. He wasn't going to risk his last carriers for a bunch of Marines on a beach. The argument on the Saratoga turned bitter. Admiral Turner, aggressive and abrasive, stood his ground. He chided his superior officer. He told Fletcher that the decision had been made to risk everything. They had orders. But Fletcher was haunted. In Washington, Admiral King had already questioned his fighting spirit after the Battle of the Coral Sea. Now, on the eve of America's first offensive, Fletcher was already planning his retreat. To the Marines listening, the message was clear: you are on your own. Then came the rehearsal. July 28th, Koro Island, Fiji. It was supposed to be a practice run. It turned into a catastrophe. The landing craft broke down. Communications failed.
Only 1/3 of the troops even managed to reach the beach. General Vandegrift, the Marine commander, called it a complete bust. It was a chaotic mess, but there was no time to fix it. The clock was ticking. On July 31st, the fleet turned north, towards the enemy. On the afternoon of August 6th, as the 75 ships approached Guadalcanal through the rain, the tension was suffocating.
Admiral Fletcher was already pulling his carriers back, nervous, keeping them far from the island. The Americans were sailing blind, with bad maps and raw troops. But they had one advantage: the Japanese were even blinder. As the massive invasion fleet slipped into the Solomons, the Japanese Imperial Command had absolutely no idea they were coming. Why did the Japanese miss a fleet of 75 ships? Because they were looking the wrong way.
In July 1942, the Imperial Army was obsessed with New Guinea. Major General Tomitaro Horii had landed his elite South Seas force at Buna. They were hacking their way over the brutal Owen Stanley Mountains to take Port Moresby. Every available Japanese bomber and Zero fighter was focused on pounding the Australians. Meanwhile, Admiral Yamamoto was sitting comfortably aboard the Yamato, anchored safely in home waters at Hashirajima. He was planning the next phase of the war at a leisurely pace. He had no idea the war was coming to him. The Japanese failure was total. In early August, Japanese pilots actually spotted American carrier planes on their radar, but they dismissed them. They had been told that the U.S. fleet was destroyed at Midway. They assumed these were just stray planes ferrying supplies to Australia. It was the height of arrogance. After 8 months of unbroken victories, the Japanese High Command simply didn't believe the Allies were capable of a complex amphibious invasion. They thought the Americans were too soft, too disorganized. If a Japanese officer had suggested that 19,000 Marines were about to storm their beaches, he would have been laughed out of the room. But the laughter was about to stop. August 7th, 1942. Dawn. For 2 days, rain had hidden the American fleet. But as the sun rose, the sky cleared. The cloak of invisibility was gone. It was time to strike. At 6 o'clock, the flight decks of the Wasp, the Saratoga, and the Enterprise roared to life. Dozens of Wildcats and dauntless dive bombers clawed into the air. Their targets were the small islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The Japanese garrison was asleep. They didn't wake up until 6:12 a.m., when the first bombs started falling.
The radio operator at Tulagi tapped out a frantic, final message to Rabaul. Enemy heavy bombardment in progress. Then the radio went dead. On the water, the surprise was absolute. American fighters strafed the seaplane base at Gavutu. They found 9 massive 4-engine Kawanishi Mavis flying boats sitting on the water like sitting ducks. They tore them to pieces. Before the Japanese pilots could even run to their cockpits, their air force was burning.
Meanwhile, on the troop transports, thousands of young Marines crowded the rails. They looked out and saw Guadalcanal for the first time. It looked terrifying. Huge, dark mountains rising out of the sea. Then, the warships opened fire. Cruisers and destroyers pounded the shoreline. An oil dump at Lunga Point exploded, sending a pillar of black smoke thousands of feet into the air. To the nervous Marines, it looked like the apocalypse. But from the jungle, there was only silence. At 09, the landing craft hit the sand. The Marines stormed ashore, rifles ready, expecting a wall of machine gun fire. This was the first American amphibious invasion since the Spanish-American War. Nobody knew what to do. They were terrified. But the jungle was silent. On Guadalcanal, the surprise was so total that the Japanese construction troops had simply vanished into the hills. The Marines walked into the enemy camp and found a ghost town. They found wooden barracks that hadn't even been slept in yet. In the mess tent, they found breakfast still warm on the table. Bowls of rice, meat, cooked plums. Chopsticks were scattered on the floor, dropped mid-bite when the first American shells hit. It seemed too easy. The Marines started to relax. They started to celebrate. But 20 miles away, across the water, on the island of Tulagi, there was no celebration. There was only blood. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson and his raiders, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, had landed right into a hornet's nest. They weren't facing construction workers. They were facing the Yokohama Air Group. These were the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, the Marines of the Imperial Navy. Elite. Fanatical. Edson's raiders were the toughest troops America had. They were an experiment, modeled after the Chinese guerrillas. They were trained to kill in the dark. Tulagi wasn't just a battle. It was the first true test.
The first time the unstoppable American force met the immovable Japanese object. At 08:15 a.m., Edson's raiders hit the beach on Tulagi. The first enemy wasn't the Japanese. It was the island itself. The raiders faced a green wall, thick jungle, vines, and bougainvillea bushes with beautiful flowers and razor-sharp thorns. It took them 3 agonizing hours just to hack a 1.5-mile path up to the central ridge. When they crested the hill, the trap sprung.
The Japanese had turned the limestone cliffs into a fortress. They had dug deep caves and rock bunkers, creating interlocking fields of fire. They fired from above, pinning the Marines down. The raiders realized that bullets wouldn't work. They had to get personal. They crawled up the vertical cliffs, inch by inch, and dropped bundles of dynamite right into the mouths of the caves. But even a blown cave wasn't safe.
In one hole, after the smoke cleared, a Marine went in to grab a radio. A dying Japanese survivor shot him dead. Then came the snipers. They tied themselves to the tops of trees. Their tactic was terrifying. They would let the lead Marines walk past them unharmed, and then shoot the men in the back. As night fell, the raiders dug in. They thought the fighting was over. They were wrong.
At 10:30 p.m., the jungle erupted in screaming. The Japanese launched a desperate, suicidal counterattack, a banzai charge. They broke through the lines, separating 2 Marine companies. It turned into a brawl. Men fought in the mud with knives, grenades, and bare hands. The Japanese wave pushed relentlessly along the ridge, getting within 50 yards of Colonel Edson's command post. The Marines held the line, but by dawn, they knew. This war would be unlike anything they had ever imagined. August 8th, the second day of the slaughter on Tulagi. The Marines were learning a lesson that would define the Pacific War. The Japanese soldier does not surrender. Clearing the caves was gruesome work. In one dugout, the raiders found 35 bodies. Some were rotting, others had just died. They realized the enemy's tactic was simple: hold until death. Then they found a bunker with 3 Japanese officers trapped inside.
The Marines prepared to storm it, but they heard 3 distinct shots. Pop, pop, pop. Inside, they found 3 corpses and 1 pistol. The ranking officer had shot his 2 subordinates and then turned the gun on himself. The Marines quickly learned that mercy was a weakness. Japanese soldiers would pretend to surrender, hiding a grenade behind their back, just to take 1 American with them. The order went down the line: no prisoners. But the fighting wasn't just tragic. It was vicious. Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss found a Japanese cave that was pinning down his squad. He crawled up and threw a grenade inside. The Japanese threw it back. Goss tried again. He pulled the pin,
held it for 3 terrifying seconds, and threw it. They threw it back again. Now furious, Goss grabbed a satchel charge, a bag of TNT. He shoved it into the cave entrance.
The Japanese shoved it back out. It exploded right in front of him, driving rock splinters into his leg. Most men would have retreated. Goss got angry. Bleeding and limping, he picked up his submachine gun and charged straight into the darkness of the cave, firing wild. When the smoke cleared, 4 Japanese soldiers were dead. If Tulagi was bad, the twin islands of Gavutu and Tanambogo were worse. These islands were the headquarters of the seaplane base.
The Japanese had dug into the 150-foot hills overlooking the beaches, creating a killing zone. When the Marines landed tanks to break the deadlock, the fighting turned medieval. The Japanese didn't run from the armored monsters. They swarmed them. Screaming soldiers charged the tanks with crowbars, trying to jam the treads. They threw Molotov cocktails, rags soaked in gasoline, onto the engine vents. In one chaotic moment, a Marine tank commander popped his hatch to fire his machine gun.
He mowed down 23 attackers, but the 24th Japanese soldier scrambled up the side of the tank and stabbed him to death with a bayonet. Then he threw a burning rag inside, turning the steel beast into an oven. As night fell, the Marines were stalled. They needed reinforcements to cross the narrow causeway to Tanambogo. Then, a tragic mistake happened. A U.S. Navy destroyer fired a support volley. One shell hit a Japanese fuel dump right on the beach.
It exploded with the brightness of the sun. The night turned into noon. The landing Marines were suddenly silhouetted against the fire, perfectly illuminated targets. The Japanese machine gunners on the hill didn't miss. They poured fire into the boats. Coxswains were killed at the tiller. Boats spun out of control. It was a massacre. It took until 4 a.m. the next morning to finally secure the islands. When the fighting started, there were 500 Japanese defenders. When it ended, there were none. While the Marines were bleeding on the beaches, the sky was turning black. At the massive Japanese base of Rabaul, the radio message from Tulagi had hit like a bomb. Enemy invasion. The Japanese commanders didn't hesitate. They scrambled everything they had. 27 Betty bombers and 18 deadly Zero fighters roared into the air. At 1 p.m., the radar screens on the USS Enterprise lit up. The first American interceptors, flying the stubby F-4F Wildcat, climbed to meet them. Among them was Lieutenant Vincent Dupois. He dived on the bombers and drew first blood, sending a Japanese Betty spiraling into the sea. But then the Zeros arrived. This was the moment the American pilots learned the hard truth. The Mitsubishi Zero was the best dogfighter in the world. It was faster, lighter, and could turn on a dime. Lieutenant Gordon Fireball led a flight of 6 Wildcats against them. It was a slaughter. 10 Zeros swarmed Fireball's unit. In seconds, they shot down 3 American planes. Fireball himself was hit. His plane riddled with bullets, he bailed out into the shark-infested waters near Santa Isabel Island. Radio electrician T.W. Rhodes managed to shoot down a Zero, the first of the campaign. But the cost was brutal.
Machinist Warden was shot down. Pilot Stevenson was killed.
The Japanese bombers punched through the American defense. The U.S. Navy realized that in a fair fight, the Wildcat was outmatched. To survive, they would have to rewrite the book on aerial combat. The Americans had a secret weapon. It wasn't a plane. It was a man with a radio. High on a hill on the island of Bougainville, behind enemy lines, sat an Australian planter named Paul Mason. He was a coast watcher. At 09 a.m., Mason looked up and saw the Japanese formation thundering overhead. He tapped out a message that saved thousands of lives. 24 bombers headed yours. The American fleet had 2 hours warning. On the Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra, the captain used the time for grim humor. The loudspeaker announced, "The ship will be attacked at noon. All hands will eat lunch at 11. When the Japanese arrived at noon, the Americans were waiting.
Among the Japanese pilots was a legend, Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, the Empire's greatest living ace. Sakai tore through the American defense. He shot down a Wildcat fighter. He shot down a Dauntless dive bomber. He was unstoppable. But then he made a mistake. He spotted a formation of American planes. He thought they were Wildcats. He attacked from the rear, expecting an easy kill. But they weren't fighters. They were SBD Dauntless bombers. And they had rear gunners. As Sakai closed in, 8 .30 caliber machine guns opened fire right into his face. The cockpit exploded. A bullet creased his skull, blinding him in one eye and paralyzing the left side of his body. Any other man would have died instantly. But Sakai was a samurai of the air. Blinded, bleeding, and fighting unconsciousness, he managed to fly his shattered Zero 560 miles back to Rabaul. It remains one of the greatest feats of survival in aviation history. The air war settled into a brutal pattern. The American pilots, in their F-4F Wildcats, quickly realized they were flying bathtubs compared to the Japanese Zeros. The Zero could fly rings around them. It climbed faster. It turned tighter. But the Wildcat had one advantage that saved hundreds of lives. It was built like a tank. Armor plating protected the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented explosions.
A Wildcat could take a pounding and still bring its pilot home. The Zero, made of lightweight alloy to gain speed, turned into a torch if it was hit once. But the Japanese had another enemy: distance. Commander Tadashi Nakajima, leading the Rabaul Air Group, faced a logistical nightmare. His pilots had to fly 560 miles to Guadalcanal, fight for 15 minutes, and fly 560 miles back. It was an 1,100-mile round trip. Exhaustion became as deadly as American bullets.
On the ground, the Marines felt secure. They captured a prisoner who revealed the truth. There were only 600 actual combat troops on the island. The rest were laborers who had fled. But at sea, the safety was an illusion. August 8th, 08:40 a.m. Another coast watcher, Jack Reed, hiding on Bougainville, broke radio silence. 45 bombers heading yours. This time, the Japanese got through. A crippled Japanese bomber, trailing smoke, didn't bail out. The pilot aimed his dying machine straight at the transport ship USS George F. Elliott. He slammed into the deck, turning the ship into an inferno. Moments later, a torpedo bomber caught the destroyer USS Jarvis, ripping her hull open. The cakewalk was over. The Japanese Navy was beginning to draw blood. By the evening of August 8th, the American pilots were learning how to survive. They couldn't outturn the Zero, so they stopped trying. Instead, they used teamwork. They developed the scissors maneuver, later famous as the thatch weave. If a Zero got on a wildcat's tail, another wildcat would cut across his path, turning the hunter into the hunted. It was the only way to equalize the odds. On the ground, the slaughter at Tulagi and Tanambogo finally ended. The Japanese garrison of 500 men had been wiped out to the last man. They had chosen death over surrender.
But across the water on Guadalcanal, the war still felt like a phony war. The Marines reached the Japanese airfield. They named it Henderson Field, in honor of a brave pilot killed at Midway. But they hadn't found the enemy main force yet. Richard Tregaskis, a famous war correspondent, heard a young Marine complain, "I wish those Japanese would come out and fight. All they do is run." The Marine didn't know how soon he would regret those words.
Because at sea, a disaster was unfolding. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher looked at his fuel gauges and his fighter losses. He had lost 21 planes. He got nervous. At 6 p.m., Fletcher made the decision that would haunt the campaign. He radioed Admiral Gormley that he was withdrawing the aircraft carriers immediately. He didn't even wait for a reply. He turned his ship south and ran. When Admiral Turner, commanding the transport ships, intercepted that message, he went pale.
Fletcher was taking the air cover with him. The transports and the Marines on the beach were now naked. While the American carriers were running away, a new player entered the game. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, the commander of the Japanese 8th Fleet, was sitting in Rabaul when the news hit. He didn't panic. He reacted with cold aggression. His first move was to rush reinforcements. He loaded 500 soldiers onto transports and sent them south.
But an ancient American submarine, the S-38, was waiting in the dark. It put 2 torpedoes into the transport Mayo Maru, sending 342 men to the bottom. Mikawa realized that sending slow transport ships was suicide. He changed his plan. He wouldn't send troops, he would send guns. He scraped together every warship he could find, 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. He hoisted his flag on the heavy cruiser Chokai. It was a fast, deadly ship, armed with massive 8-inch guns and the terrifying long lance torpedoes. Mikawa's plan was reckless. He would steam straight down the slot, the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands. He timed his speed perfectly to arrive off Guadalcanal exactly at midnight. He knew he had no air cover. He knew the Americans had carriers. He didn't know they were leaving. But Mikawa had an ace up his sleeve: the night. The U.S. Navy was terrified of fighting in the dark. The Japanese Navy had spent decades training for it. Mikawa planned to slip in under the cover of darkness, smash the American transport fleet while they slept, and vanish before dawn. The Japanese admiral was walking into a trap. But the trap was broken. The American defense relied on eyes in the sky.
Admiral Gormley had a complex web of search planes, Army B-17s from Australia, and Navy PBY flying boats commanded by Admiral John S. McCain. But the system was a mess. Early that morning, a B-17 had actually spotted Mikawa's fleet. The pilot reported, ships moving south. But the report was delayed. When it finally reached the fleet, the commanders dismissed it. They thought they were just seaplane tenders setting up a base, not heavy cruisers coming to kill them.
They didn't realize that Mikawa was racing down a specific geographic corridor, a narrow lane of deep water running between the islands of Choiseul, Santa Isabel, and Guadalcanal. The Marines would soon give this stretch of water a name that smelled of death: the Slot. On the night of August 8th, the disaster was sealed by a single mistake. Admiral Turner had ordered a specific air search of the Slot to make sure no enemy ships were coming.
But the order got lost in the confusion of radio traffic. Admiral McCain never received it. The search planes never took off. The Slot was left wide open. So as the sun set on August 8th, the Allied fleet